Chapter 1, Good and Evil, Good and Bad. 1. Those English psychologists, who up to the present are the only philosophers who are to be thanked for any endeavor to get as far as a history of the origin of morality. These men, I say, offer us in their own personalities no paltry problem. They even have, if I am to be quite frank about it, in th. These English psychologists, what do they really mean? We always find them voluntarily or involuntarily at the same task of pushing to the front the party hauntus of our inner world, and looking for the efficient, governing, and decisive principle in that precise quarter, where the intellectual self-respect of the race would be the most reluctant to fie. Is it an instinct for human disparagement, somewhat sinister, vulgar, and malignant, or perhaps incomprehensible even to itself? Or perhaps a touch of pessimistic jealousy, the mistrust of disillusioned idealists who have become gloomy, poisoned, and bitter? Or a petty subconscious enmity and rancor against Christianity and Plato that has conceivably never crossed the threshold of consciousness? Or just a vicious taste for those elements of life which are bizarre, painfully paradoxical, mystical, and illogical? Or, as a final alternative, a dash of each of these motives. A little vulgarity, a little gloominess, a little anti-Christianity, a little craving for the necessary piquancy. But I am told that it is simply a case of old frigid and tedious frogs crawling and hopping around men and inside men, as if they were as thoroughly at home there as they would be in a swamp. I am opposed to this statement, nay, I do not believe it. And if, in the impossibility of knowledge, one is permitted to wish, so do I wish from my heart that just the converse metaphor should apply, and that these analysts with their psychological microscopes should be, at bottom, brave, proud, and 2. All honor, then, to the noble spirits who would fain dominate these historians of morality. But it is certainly a pity that they lack the historical sense itself, that they themselves are quite deserted by all the beneficent spirits of history. The whole train of their thought runs, as was always the way of old-fashioned philosophers, on thoroughly unhistorical lines. There is no doubt on this point. The crass ineptitude of their genealogy of morals is immediately apparent when the question arises of ascertaining the origin of the idea and judgment of good. Man had originally, so speaks their decree, praised and called good altruistic acts from the standpoint of those on whom they were co. This pride must be brought low, this system of values must lose its values. Is that attained? Now the first argument that comes ready to my hand is that the real homestead of the concept, good, is sought and located in the wrong place. The judgment good did not originate among those to whom goodness was shown. Much rather has it been the good themselves, that is, the aristocratic, the powerful, the high-stationed, the high-minded, who have felt that they themselves were good, and that their actions were good, that is to say of the first order, in contradistinction to all the low-minded, the vulgar. It was out of this pathos of distance that they first arrogated the right to create values for their own profit, and to coin the names of such values. What had they to do with utility? The standpoint of utility is as alien and as inapplicable as it could possibly be, when we have to deal with so volcanic an effervescence of supreme values, creating and demarcating as they do a hierarchy within themselves. It is at this juncture that one arrives at an appreciation of the contrastee. The pathos of nobility and distance, as I have said, the chronic and despotic esprit de corps and fundamental instinct of a higher dominant race coming into association with a meaner race, an under race. This is the origin of the antithesis of good and bad. The master's right of giving names goes so far that it is permissible to look upon language itself as the expression of the power of the masters. They say, this is that, and that. They seal finally every object and every event with a sound, and thereby at the same time take possession of it. On the contrary, it is on the occasion of the decay of aristocratic values that the antitheses between egoistic and altruistic presses more and more heavily on the human conscience. It is, to use my own language, the herd instinct which finds in this antithesis an expression in many ways. and even then, it takes a considerable time for this instinct to become sufficiently dominant, for the valuation to be inextricably dependent on this antithesis, as is the case in contemporary Europe. For today that prejudice is predominant, which, acting even now with all the intensity of an obses. 3. In the second place, quite apart from the fact that this hypothesis as to the genesis of the value, good, cannot be historically upheld, it suffers from an inherent psychological contradiction. The utility of altruistic conduct has presumably been the origin of its being praised, and this origin has become forgotten. But in what conceivable way is this forgetting possible? Has perchance the utility of such conduct ceased at some given moment? The contrary is the case. This utility has rather been experienced every day at all times, and is consequently a feature that obtains a new and regular emphasis with every fresh day. It follows that, so far from vanishing from the consciousness, so far indeed from being forgotten, it must necessarily become impressed on the. How much more logical is that contrary theory? It is not the truer for that, which is represented, for instance, by Herbert Spencer, who places the concept good as essentially similar to the concept useful, purposive, so that in the judgments good and bad mankind is simply summarizing and. 4. The guidepost which first put me on the right track was this question: what is the true etymological significance of the various symbols for the idea, good, which have been coined in the various languages? I then found that they all led back to the same evolution of the same idea, that everywhere aristocrat, noble in the social sense, is the root idea, out of which have necessarily developed good in the sense of with aristocratic soul, noble in the sense of with a soul of high caliber. It is at the sufficiently late period of the 30 Years' War that this sense becomes changed to the sense now current. From the standpoint of the genealogy of morals, this discovery seems to be substantial. The lateness of it is to be attributed to the retarding influence exercised in the modern world by democratic prejudice in the sphere of all questions of origin. This extends, as will shortly be shown, even to the province of natural science and physiology, which, prima facie, is the most objective. The extent of the mischief which is caused by this prejudice, once it is free of all trammels except those of its own malice, particularly to ethics and history, is shown by the notorious case of Buckle. It was in Buckle that plebeianism of the modern spirit, which is of English origin, broke. 5. With regard to our problem, which can justly be called an intimate problem, and which elects to appeal to only a limited number of ears, it is of no small interest to ascertain that in those words and roots which denote good, we catch glimpses of that arch trait, on the strength of which the aristo. Indeed, they call themselves in perhaps the most frequent instances, simply after their superiority in power, e.g. the powerful, the lords, the commanders, or after the most obvious sign of their superiority, as for example, the rich, the possessors. That is the meaning of aria, and the Iranian and Slav languages correspond. But they also call themselves after some characteristic idiosyncrasy, and this is the case which now concerns us. They name themselves, for instance, the truthful. This is first done by the Greek nobility whose mouthpiece is found in Theognis, the Megarian poet. The word letter 1F10 sigma theta lambda omicron sigma, which is coined for the purpose, signifies etymologically one who has reality, who is real, who is true, and then with a subjective twist, the true as the truthful. At this stage in the evolution of the idea, it becomes the motto and party cry of the nobility, and qui. In the word kappa alpha kappa omicron sigma, as in delta epsilon iota lambda omicron sigma. The plebeian in contrast to the letter 1F00 gamma alpha theta omicron sigma, the cowardice is emphasized. This affords perhaps an inkling on what lines the etymological origin of the very ambiguous letter 1F00 gamma alpha theta omicron sigma is to be investigated. In the Latin malus, which I place side by side with mu epsilon lambda alpha sigma, the vulgar man can be distinguished as the dark-colored, and above all as the black-haired, hic niger est, as the pre-Aryan inhabitants of the Italian soil, whose complexion formed the clearest feature of distinction from the dominant BL. The Celts, if I may make a parenthetic statement, were throughout a blonde race. And it is wrong to connect, as Virchow still connects, those traces of an essentially dark-haired population, which are to be seen on the more elaborate ethnographical maps of Germany with any Celtic ancestry, or with any. The same is true substantially of the whole of Europe. In point of fact, the subject race has finally again obtained the upper hand, in complexion and the shortness of the skull, and perhaps in the intellectual and social qualities. Who can guarantee that modern democracy, still more modern anarchy, and indeed that tendency to the commune, the most primitive form of society, which is now common to all the socialists in Europe, does not in its real essence signify a monstrous reversion, and that the conquering and master race, T. Bonus accordingly as the man of discord, of variance, and swayung, duo, as the warrior, one sees what in ancient Rome the good meant for a man. Must not our actual German word gut mean, the godlike, the man of godlike race, and be identical with the national name, originally the noble's name of the Goths? The grounds for this supposition do not appertain to this work. 6. Above all, there is no exception, though there are opportunities for exceptions, to this rule, that the idea of political superiority always resolves itself into the idea of psychological superiority, in those cases where the highest caste is at the same time the priestly caste, and in accordance why. It is in these cases, for instance, that clean and unclean confront each other for the first time as badges of class distinction. Here again there develops a good and a bad, in a sense which has ceased to be merely social. Moreover, care should be taken not to take these ideas of clean and unclean too seriously, too broadly, or too symbolically. All the ideas of ancient man have, on the contrary, got to be understood in their initial stages, in a sense which is, to an almost inconceivable extent, crude, coarse pH. The clean man is originally only a man who washes himself, who abstains from certain foods which are conducive to skin diseases, who does not sleep with the unclean women of the lower classes, who has a horror of blood, not more, not much more. On the other hand, the very nature of a priestly aristocracy shows the reasons why just at such an early juncture there should ensue a really dangerous sharpening and intensification of opposed values. It is, in fact, through these opposed values that gulfs are cleft in the social plane, which aver. There is from the outset a certain diseased taint in such sacerdotal aristocracies, and in the habits which prevail in such societies, habits which, averse as they are to action, constitute a compound of introspection and explosive emotionalism, as a result of which there appears that introspective M. Humanity itself is still diseased from the effects of the naivete of this priestly cure. Take, for instance, certain kinds of diet abstention from flesh, fasts, sexual continence, flight into the wilderness, a kind of Weir-Mitchell isolation, though of course without that system of excessive feeding and fattening, which is the most efficient antidote to all the hysteria of the ascetic. In sacerdotal societies, every element is on a more dangerous scale, not merely cures and remedies, but also pride, revenge, cunning, exaltation, love, ambition, virtue, morbidity. Further, it can fairly be stated that it is on the soil of this essentially dangerous form of human society, the sacerdo. 7. The reader will have already surmised with what ease the priestly mode of valuation can branch off from the knightly aristocratic mode, and then develop into the very antithesis of the latter. Special impetus is given to this opposition by every occasion when the castes of the priests and warriors. The knightly aristocratic values are based on a careful cult of the physical, on a flowering, rich, and even effervescing healthiness that goes considerably beyond what is necessary for maintaining life, on war, adventure, the chase, the dance, the tourney, on everything, in fact, which is contain. The priestly aristocratic mode of valuation is, we have seen, based on other hypotheses. It is bad enough for this class when it is a question of war. Yet the priests are, as is notorious, the worst enemies, Why? Because they are the weakest. Their weakness causes their hate to expand into a monstrous and sinister shape, a shape which is most crafty and most poisonous. The really great haters in the history of the world have always been priests, who are also the cleverest haters. In comparison with the cleverness of priestly revenge, every other piece of cleverness is practically negligible. Human history would be too fatuous for anything were it not for the cleverness imported into it by the weak. Take at once the most important instance. All the world's efforts against the aristocrats, the mighty, the masters, the holders of power, are negligible by comparison with what has been accomplished against those classes by the Jews. The Jews, that priestly nation which eventually realized that the one method of effecting satisfactio. Yet the method was only appropriate to a nation of priests, to a nation of the most jealously nursed priestly revengefulness. It was the Jews who, in opposition to the aristocratic equation, good equals aristocratic equals beautiful equals happy equals loved by the gods, dared with a terrifying logic to suggest the contrary equation, and indeed to maintain with the teeth of the most profound hatred, the hatred of weakness, this contrary equa. In the context of the monstrous and inordinately fateful initiative which the Jews have exhibited in connection with this most fundamental of all declarations of war, I remember the passage which came to my pen on another occasion, Beyond Good and Evil, APH. 195. That it was, in fact, with the Jews that the revolt of the slaves begins in the sphere of morals, that revolt which has behind it a history of 2 millennia, and which at the present day has only moved out of our sight, because it has achieved victory. 8. But you understand this not. You have no eyes for a force which has taken 2,000 years to achieve victory. There is nothing wonderful in this. All lengthy processes are hard to see and to realize. But this is what took place. From the trunk of that tree of revenge and hate, Jewish hate, that most profound and sublime hate, which creates ideals and changes old values to new creations, the like of which has never been on earth, there grew a phenomenon which was equally incomparable, a new love. But beware of supposing that this love has soared on its upward growth, as in any way a real negation of that thirst for revenge, as an antithesis to the Jewish hate. No, the contrary is the truth. This love grew out of that hate, as its crown, as its triumphant crown, circling wider and wider amid the clarity and fullness of the sun, and pursuing in the very kingdom of light and height its goal of hatred, its victory, its spoil, its strategy, with the same intensity with which the roots of thaw. This Jesus of Nazareth, the incarnate gospel of love, this Redeemer, bringing salvation and victory to the poor, the sick, the sinful, was he not really temptation in its most sinister and irresistible form? Temptation to take the tortuous path to those very Jewish values and those very Jewish ideal. Has not Israel really obtained the final goal of its sublime revenge by the tortuous paths of this Redeemer, for all that he might pose as Israel's adversary and Israel's destroyer? Is it not due to the black magic of a really great policy of revenge, of a far-seeing, burrowing revenge, both acting and calculating with slowness, that Israel himself must repudiate before all the world the actual instrument of his own revenge and nail it to the cross, so that all the world, that I, could, moreover, any human mind with all its elaborate ingenuity invent, a bait that was more truly dangerous. Anything that was even equivalent in the power of its seductive, intoxicating, defiling, and corrupting influence to that symbol of the Holy Cross, to that awful paradox of a God on the cross, to that mystery of the unthinkable, supreme, and utter horror of the self-crucifixion of a God for the saw. It is at least certain that sub hoc signo Israel, with its revenge and transvaluation of all values, has up to the present always triumphed again over all other ideals, over all more aristocratic ideals. 9. But why do you talk of nobler ideals? Let us submit to the facts that the people have triumphed, or the slaves, or the populace, or the herd, or whatever name you care to give them. If this has happened through the Jews, so be it. In that case, no nation ever had a greater mission in the world's history. The masters have been done away with. The morality of the vulgar man has triumphed. This triumph may also be called a blood poisoning. It has mutually fused the races. I do not dispute it, but there is no doubt but that this intoxication has succeeded. The redemption of the human race, that is, from the masters, is progressing swimmingly. Everything is obviously becoming Judaized or Christianized or vulgarized. What is there in the words? It seems impossible to stop the course of this poisoning through the whole body politic of mankind. But its tempo and pace may from the present time be slower, more delicate, quieter, more discreet. There is time enough. In view of this context, has the Church nowadays any necessary purpose? Has it, in fact, a right to live? Or could man get on without it? Quaeritur. It seems that it fetters and retards this tendency, instead of accelerating it. Well, even that might be its utility. The Church certainly is a crude and boorish institution that is repugnant to an intelligence with any pretense at delicacy, to aerially modern taste. Should it not at any rate learn to be somewhat more subtle? It alienates nowadays more than it allures. Which of us would, forsooth, be a free thinker if there were no Church? It is the Church which repels us, not its poison. Apart from the Church we like the poison. This is the epilogue of a free thinker to my discourse, of an honorable animal, as he has given abundant proof, and a democrat to boot. He had up to that time listened to me, and could not endure my silence. 10. The revolt of the slaves in morals begins in the very principle of resentment, becoming creative and giving birth to values. A resentment experienced by creatures who, deprived as they are of the proper outlet of action, are forced to find their compensation in an imaginary revenge. While every aristocratic morality springs from a triumphant affirmation of its own demands, the slave morality says no from the very outset to what is outside itself, different from itself, and not itself. And this no is its creative deed. This volte-face of the valuing standpoint, this inevitable gravitation to the objective instead of back to the subjective, is typical of resentment. The slave morality requires as the condition of its existence an external and objective world. To employ physiological terminology, it requires objecti. The contrary is the case when we come to the aristocrat's system of values. It acts and grows spontaneously. It merely seeks its antithesis in order to pronounce a more grateful and exultant yes to its own self. Its negative conception, low, vulgar, bad, is merely a pale late-born foil in co. When the aristocratic morality goes astray and commits sacrilege on reality, this is limited to that particular sphere with which it is not sufficiently acquainted. A sphere, in fact, from the real knowledge of which it disdainfully defends itself. It misjudges, in some cases, the sphere which it despises, the sphere of the common vulgar man and the low people. On the other hand, due weight should be given to the consideration that in any case the mood of contempt, of disdain, of superciliousness, even on the supposition that it falsely portra. In point of fact, there is in contempt too strong an admixture of nonchalance, of casualness, of boredom, of impatience, even of personal exultation, for it to be capable of distorting its victim into a real caricature or a real monstrosity. Attention again should be paid to the almost benevolent nuances, which, for instance, the Greek nobility imports into all the words by which it distinguishes the common people from itself. Note how continuously a kind of pity, care, and consideration imparts its honeyed flavor, until at last almost. The well-born simply felt themselves the happy. They did not have to manufacture their happiness artificially through looking at their enemies, or in cases to talk and lie themselves into happiness, as is the custom with all resentful men, and similarly, complete men as they were, exuberant wit. While the aristocratic man lived in confidence and openness with himself, gamma epsilon nu nu alpha letter 1 FD0 omicron sigma, nobly epsilon born, emphasizes the nuance sincere, and perhaps also naif. The resentful man, on the other hand, is neither sincere nor naif, nor honest and candid with himself. His soul squints. His mind loves hidden crannies, tortuous paths and backdoors. Everything secret appeals to him as his world, his safety, his balm. He is past master in silence, in not forgetting, in waiting, in provisional self-depreciation and self-abasement. A race of such resentful men will of necessity eventually prove more prudent than any aristocratic race. It will honor prudence on quite a distinct scale, as, in fact, a paramount condition of existence, while prudence among aristocratic men is apt to be tinged with a delicate flavor of luxury and, when the resentment of the aristocratic man manifests itself, it fulfills and exhausts itself in an immediate reaction, and consequently instills no venom. On the other hand, it never manifests itself at all in countless instances, when in the case of the feeble and weak it would be inevitable. An inability to take seriously for any length of time their enemies, their disasters, their misdeeds. That is the sign of the full, strong natures who possess a superfluity of molding plastic force that heals completely and produces forgetfulness. A good example of this in the modern world is Murabe. Such a man indeed shakes off with a shrug many a worm which would have buried itself in another. It is only in characters like these that we see the possibility, supposing, of course, that there is such a possibility in the world of the real love of one's enemies. What respect for his enemies is. He insists on having his enemy to himself as his distinction. He tolerates no other enemy, but a man in whose character there is nothing to despise and much to honor. On the other hand, imagine the enemy as the resentful man conceives him, and it is here exactly that we see his work, his creativeness. He has conceived the evil enemy, the evil one, and indeed that is the root idea from which he now evolves as a contrasting and corresponding figure, a good one. 11. The method of this man is quite contrary to that of the aristocratic man, who conceives the root idea, good, spontaneously and straight away, that is to say, out of himself, and from that material then creates for himself a concept of bad. This bad of aristocratic origin and that evil out of the cauldron of unsatisfied hatred, the former an imitation, an extra, an additional nuance. The latter, on the other hand, the original, the beginning, the essential act in the conception of a slave morality. These two words, bad and evil. This particular point we would be the last to deny. The man who learnt to know those good ones only as enemies, learnt at the same time not to know them only as evil enemies, and the same men who inter pares were kept so rigorously in bounds through convention, respect, custom, and gratitude, though they enjoy their freedom from all social control. They feel that in the wilderness they can give vent with impunity to that tension which is produced by enclosure and imprisonment in the peace of society. They revert to the innocence of the beast of prey conscience, like jubilant monsters, who purrha. It is impossible not to recognize at the core of all these aristocratic races the beast of prey, the magnificent blonde brute, avidly rampant for spoil and victory. This hidden core needed an outlet from time to time. The beast must get loose again, must return into the wilderness. The Roman, Arabic. It is the aristocratic races who have left the idea, barbarian, on all the tracks in which they have marched. Nay, a consciousness of this very barbarianism, and even a pride in it, manifests itself even in their highest civilization. For example, when Pericles says to his Athenians in that Celebrat, this audacity of aristocratic races, mad, absurd and spasmodic as may be its expression, the incalculable and fantastic nature of their enterprises, Pericles sets in special relief and glory the rho alpha theta upsilon mu iota alpha of the Athenians, their nonchalance and contempt for safety, body, life, and comfort, their awful. I have once called attention to the embarrassment of Hesiod, when he conceived the series of social ages, and endeavored to express them in gold, silver, and bronze. He could only dispose of the contradiction with which he was confronted by the Homeric world, an age magnificent indeed, but at the same time so awful and so violent, by making two ages out of one, which he henceforth placed one behind each other. First, the age of the heroes and demigods as that. Granted the truth of the theory now believed to be true, that the very essence of all civilization is to train out of man, the beast of prey, a tame and civilized animal, a domesticated animal. It follows indubitably that we must regard as the real tools of civilization all those instincts of reacti. It is rather the contrary that is not only probable. Nay, it is palpable today. These bearers of vindictive instincts that have to be bottled up, these descendants of all European and non-European slavery, especially of the pre-Aryan population. These people, I say, represent the decline of humanity. These tools of civilization are a disgrace to humanity, and constitute in reality more of an argument against civilization, more of a reason why civilization should be suspected. One may be perfectly justified in being always afraid of the blonde beast that lies at the core of all aristocratic races, and in being on one's guard. But who would not 100 times prefer to be afraid, when one at the same time admires, than to be immune from fear, at the cost of being Perpetua? And is that not our fate? What produces today our repulsion towards man? For we suffer from man, there is no doubt about it. It is not fear, it is rather that we have nothing more to fear from men. It is that the worm man is in the foreground and pullulates. It is that the tame man, the wretched, mediocre, and unedifying creature, has learnt to consider himself a goal and a pinnacle, an inner meaning, an historic princi. 12. I cannot refrain at this juncture from uttering a sigh, in one last hope. What is it precisely which I find intolerable? That which I alone cannot get rid of, which makes me choke and faint. Bad air. Bad air. That something misbegotten comes near me, that I must inhale the odor of the entrails of a misbegotten soul. That accepted, what can one not endure in the way of need, privation, bad weather, sickness, toil, solitude? In point of fact, one manages to get over everything, born as one is to a burrowing and battling existence. One always returns once again to the light, one always lives again one's golden hour of victory, and then one stands as one was born, unbreakable, tense, ready for something more difficult, But from time to time do ye grant me, assuming that beyond good and evil there are goddesses who can grant, one glimpse, grant me but one glimpse only, of something perfect, fully realized, happy, mighty, triumphant, of something that still gives cause for fear. A glimpse of a man that justifies the existence of man, a glimpse of an incarnate human happiness that realizes and redeems, for the sake of which one may hold fast to the belief in man. For the position is this: in the dwarfing and leveling of the European man lurks our greatest peril, for it is this outlook which fatigues. We see today nothing which wishes to be greater. We surmise that the process is always still backwards towards something more attenuated, more. The sight of man now fatigues. What is present-day nihilism if it is not that? We are tired of man. 13. But let us come back to it. The problem of another origin of the good, as the resentful man has thought it out, demands its solution. It is not surprising that the lambs should bear a grudge against the great birds of prey, but that is no reason for blaming the great birds of prey for taking the little lambs. And when the lambs say among themselves, "These birds of prey are evil, and he who is as far removed from being a bird of prey, who is rather its opposite, a lamb, is he not good?" Then there is nothing to cavil at in the setting up of this ideal, though it may also be that the birds of prey will ray. A quantum of force is just such a quantum of movement, will, action. Rather, it is nothing else than just those very phenomena of moving, willing, acting, and can only appear otherwise in the misleading errors of language, and the fundamental fallacies of reason which have become petrified therein. W. But there is no such substratum. There is no being behind doing, working, becoming. The doer is a mere appanage to the action. The action is everything. In point of fact, the people duplicate the doing. When they make the lightning lighten, that is a doing. They make the same phenomenon first a cause, and then, secondly, the effect of that cause. The scientists fail to improve matters when they say, force moves, force causes, and so on. Our whole science is still, in spite of all its coldness, of all its freedom from passion, a dupe of the tricks of language, and has never succeeded in getting rid of that superstitious changeling, the subject. The atom, to give another instance, is such a changeling, just as the Kantian thing-in. What wonder if the suppressed and stealthily simmering passions of revenge and hatred exploit for their own advantage this belief, and indeed hold no belief with a more steadfast enthusiasm than this, that the strong has the option of being weak, and the bird of prey of being a lamb. Thereby do th. And good is everyone who does not oppress, who hurts no one, who does not attack, who does not pay back, who hands over revenge to God, who holds himself, as we do, in hiding, who goes out of the way of evil, and demands, in short, little from life, like ourselves the patient, the meek, the just. This kind of man finds the belief in a neutral, free-choosing subject, necessary from an instinct of self-preservation, of self-assertion, in which every lie is fain to sanctify itself. The subject, or, to use popular language, the soul has perhaps proved itself the best dogma in the world simply because it rendered possible to the horde of mortal, weak, and oppressed individuals of every kind, that most sublime specimen of self-deception, the interpretation of weakness as freedom. 14. Will anyone look a little into, right into, the mystery of how ideals are manufactured in this world? Who has the courage to do it? Come. Here we have a vista opened into these grimy workshops. Wait just a moment, dear mister. Inquisitive and foolhardy, your eye must first grow accustomed to this false changing light. Yes. Enough. Now speak. What is happening below down yonder? Speak out that what you see, man of the most dangerous curiosity, for now I am the listener. I see nothing, I hear the more. It is a cautious, spiteful, gentle whispering and muttering together in all the corners and crannies. It seems to me that they are lying. A sugary softness adheres to every sound. Weakness is turned to merit. There is no doubt about it. It is just as you say. Further, and the impotence which requites not is turned to goodness, craven baseness to meekness, submission to those whom one hates, to obedience, namely, obedience to one of whom they say that he ordered this submission. They call him God. The inoffensive character of the weak, the very cowardice in which he is rich, his standing at the door, his forced necessity of waiting, gain here fine names, such as patience, which is also called virtue, not being able to avenge oneself, is called not wishing to avenge oneself, perhaps. They also talk of the love of their enemies, and sweat thereby. Further, they are miserable, there is no doubt about it, all these whisperers and counterfeiters in the corners, although they try to get warm by crouching close to each other, but they tell me that their misery is a favor and distinction given to them by God, just as one beats the dogs one likes best. This they call blessedness. Further, they are now giving me to understand that not only are they better men than the mighty, the lords of the earth, whose spittle they have got to lick, not out of fear, not at all out of fear, but because God ordains that one should honor all authority. Not only are they better men, but that they also have a better time, at any rate, will one day have a better time. But enough. Enough. I can endure it no longer. Bad air. Bad air. These workshops, where ideals are manufactured, verily they reek with the crassest lies. Nay. Just 1 minute. You are saying nothing about the masterpieces of these virtuosos of black magic, who can produce whiteness, milk, and innocence out of any black you like. Have you not noticed what a pitch of refinement is attained by their chef d'oeuvre, their most audacious, subtle, ingenious, and lying artist trick? Take care. These cellar beasts, full of revenge and hate, what do they make, forsooth, out of their revenge and hate? Do you hear these words? Would you suspect, if you trusted only their words, that you are among men of resentment and nothing else? I understand. I prick my ears up again, and I hold my nose. Now do I hear for the first time that which they have said so often. We good, we are the righteous. What they demand they call not revenge, but the triumph of righteousness. What they hate is not their enemy, no, they hate unrighteousness. godlessness. What they believe in and hope is not the. And how do they name that which serves them as a solace against all the troubles of life, their phantasmagoria of their anticipated future blessedness? How? Do I hear right? They call it the last judgment, the advent of their kingdom, the kingdom of God, but in the meanwhile they live in faith, in love, in hope. Enough. Enough. 15. In the faith in what? In the love for what? In the hope of what? These weaklings, they also, forsooth, wish to be the strong sometime. There is no doubt about it. Sometime their kingdom also must come. The kingdom of God is their name for it, as has been mentioned. They are so meek in everything. Yet in order to experience that kingdom, it is necessary to live long, to live beyond death. Yes, eternal life is necessary so that one can make up forever for that earthly life in faith, in love, in hope. Make up for what? Make up by what? Dante, as it seems to me, made a crass mistake when with awe-inspiring ingenuity he placed that inscription over the gate of his hell. Me too made eternal love. At any rate, the following inscription would have a much better right to stand over the gate of the Christian paradise, and it's eternal BL. For what is the blessedness of that paradise? Possibly we could quickly surmise it, but it is better that it should be explicitly attested by an authority who in such matters is not to be disparaged, Thomas of Aquinas, the great teacher and saint. Vidi in regno celesti, says he, as gently as a lamb, videbunt ponas damnatorum, ut beatitudo illis magis complacet. Or if we wish to hear a stronger tone, a word from the mouth of a triumphant father of the church, who warned his disciples against the cruel ecstasies of the public spectacles. Boo. Faith offers us much more, says he to Spectac, c. 29 ss. Something much stronger. Thanks to the redemption, joys of quite another kind stand at our disposal. Instead of athletes, we have our martyrs. We wish for blood, well, we have the blood of Christ. But what then awaits us on the day of his return, of his triumph? And then does he proceed, does this enraptured visionary? At enim supersunt alia spectacula, ille ultimas et perpetuus judici dies, ille nationibus insperatus, ille derissus, cum tanta seculi vedustas et tot ejus nativitates uno in horienter. Qui tunc spectaculi latitudo? Quid admirer? Quid ridem? Ubigatim? Ubi exultum, spectans tot et tantos reges, qui in coelum recepti nunciabanter, cum ipso Jove et ipsis sues testibus inimis tenebris congemiscens. Item presides, the provincial governors, persecutors diminisi neminis severibus quam ipsi, flammis severunt insultantibus contra Christianos liquescens. Quos praeterea sapiens illos philosophos coram, discipulis sues una conflagrantibus irrubescens, quibus nihil ad diem pertiner suadibant, quibus animas aut nullas, aut non in pristina corpora redituras affirmabant. Etiam poetas non, ad radamanti nec ad minua, sed ad inopinati Christi tribunal palpitans. Tunc magis tragodi audiendi, magis silicet vocals, with louder tones and more violent shrieks, in sua propria calamitate, tunc histriens cognoscendi, salutiers multo per ignum, tunc spectandus origa in flammia rota totus rubens, tunc xeistici contemplandi non in gymnases, sed in jaculati. Hic est ille, dicam fabri aut quistuarii filius, as is shown by the whole of the following, and in particular by this well-known description of the mother of Jesus from the Talmud. Tertullian is henceforth referring to the Jews. Sabati destructor, Samarites et demonium habens. Hic est quem adjuda redemistis, hic est ille erendine et calafis diverberatus, sputamentis dedecoratus, fel et acet patatus. Hic est, quem clam descent subrepurant, ut resurrexis dicacur vel hortulanus detraxit, ni lactuci sui frequentia commentium laterenter. Ut talia species, ut talibus exults, quis tibi praetor aut consul aut sacerdos de sua liberalitate prastibit. Et tamen hic jam, habemus quadmodo, per fidem spiritu imaginante representata. Ceterum qualia elas sunt, qui nec oculis vidit nec oris audivit nec in cor homines ascenderunt. I cor. Roman 2. 9. Credo circo et utrac cavia, first and fourth row, or according to others the comic and the tragic stay, et omni studio gradira. Per fidem, so stands it written. 16. Let us come to a conclusion. The two opposing values, good and bad, good and evil, have fought a dreadful, 1,000-year fight in the world, and though indubitably the second value has been for a long time in the preponderance, there are not wanting places where the fortune of the fight is still undecisive. It can almost be said that in the meanwhile the fight reaches a higher and higher level, and that in the meanwhile it has become more and more intense, and always more and more psychological, so that nowadays there is perhaps no more decisive mark of the higher nature, of the more psychological natu. The symbol of this fight, written in a writing which has remained worthy of perusal throughout the course of history up to the present time, is called Rome against Judea, Judea against Rome. Hitherto there has been no greater event than that fight, the putting of that question, that deadly antagon. Rome found in the Jew the incarnation of the unnatural, as though it were its diametrically opposed monstrosity, and in Rome the Jew was held to be convicted of hatred of the whole human race, and rightly so, in so far as it is right to link the well-being and the future of the human race to the Unk. What, conversely, did the Jews feel against Rome? One can surmise it from 1,000 symptoms, but it is sufficient to carry one's mind back to the Johannian Apocalypse, that most obscene of all the written outbursts, which has revenge on its conscience. One should also appraise at its full value the profound logic of the Christian instinct, when over this very book of hate it wrote the name of the disciple of love, that self-same disciple to whom it attributed that impassioned and ecstatic gospel. Therein lurks a portion of truth, however much light. Which of them has been provisionally victorious, Rome or Judea? But there is not a shadow of doubt. Just consider to whom in Rome itself nowadays you bow down, as though before the quintessence of all the highest values, and not only in Rome, but almost over half the world, everywhere where man has been tamed or is about to be tamed, to 3 Jews, as we know, and this is very remarkable. Rome is undoubtedly defeated. At any rate, there took place in the Renaissance a brilliantly sinister revival of the classical ideal, of the aristocratic valuation of all things. Rome herself, like a man waking up from a trance, stirred beneath the burden of the new Judaized Rome that had been built over her, which presented the Judea proved yet once more victorious over the classical ideal in the French Revolution, and in a sense which was even more crucial and even more profound. The last political aristocracy that existed in Europe, that of the French 17th and 18th centuries, broke into pieces beneath the inn. Like a final signpost to other ways, there appeared Napoleon, the most unique and violent anachronism that ever existed, and in him the incarnate problem of the aristocratic ideal in itself. Consider well what a problem it is. Napoleon, that synthesis of monster and superman. 17. Was it therewith over? Was that greatest of all antitheses of ideals thereby relegated ad acta for all time? Or only postponed for a long time? May there not take place at some time or other a much more awful, much more carefully prepared flaring up of the old conflagration? Further, should not one wish that consummation with all one's strength, will it oneself, demand it oneself? He who at this juncture begins, like my readers, to reflect, to think further, will have difficulty in coming quickly to a conclusion. Ground enough for me to come myself to a conclusion, taking it for granted that for some time past what I mean has been sufficiently clear, what I exactly mean by th. Note, I avail myself of the opportunity offered by this treatise to express, openly and formally, a wish which up to the present has only been expressed in occasional conversations with scholars, namely, that some faculty of philosophy should, by means of a series of prize essays, gain the glory of. With regard to a possibility of this character, the following question deserves consideration. It merits quite as much the attention of philologists and historians as of actual professional philosophers. What indication of the history of the evolution of the moral ideas is afforded by philology, and especially by etymological investigation? On the other hand, it is of course equally necessary to induce physiologists and doctors to be interested in these problems, of the value of the valuations which have prevailed up to the present. In this connection, the professional philosophers may be trusted to act as the spokesman and intermediary. In point of fact, all tables of values, all the thou shalts known to history and ethnology, need primarily a physiological, at any rate in preference to a psychological, elucidation and interpretation. All equally require a critique from medical science. The question, what is the value of this or that table of values and morality, will be asked from the most varied standpoints. For instance, the question of valuable for what can never be analyzed with sufficient nicety. That, for instance, which would evidently have value with regard to promoting in a race the greatest possible powers of endurance, or with regard to increasing its adaptability to a specific climate, or with regard to the preservation of the greatest number, would have nothing like the same value. Engaging values, the good of the majority and the good of the minority are opposed standpoints. We leave it to the naivete of English biologists to regard the former standpoint as intrinsically superior. All the sciences have now to pave the way for the future task of the philosopher, this task being understood to mean that he must solve the problem of value, that he has to fix the hierarchy of values.